The message came from Earth without much noise. The Galactic Coalition had spent 11 months arguing over the peace treaty between the Xyrethan Empire and humanity, and after all the long silences and counterproposals and polite threats, both sides had agreed on one symbolic gesture to seal the deal. A marriage. One human, sent to the imperial homeworld of Xyretha Prime, to stand at the side of Queen Savara and make the alliance official in front of the galaxy. The Queen had not chosen this arrangement. Her council had handed it to her as the cleanest solution to a conflict that had gone on long enough. She accepted it the way she accepted most things she did not enjoy, with silence, a straight back, and no visible reaction. The human they sent was named Ethan Cole. He arrived on a mid-morning transport with no military markings and no escort ship flanking it. The landing platform outside the Imperial Palace was lined with Xyrethan guards in full ceremonial armor, their violet skin catching the light of the twin suns, their 4 eyes scanning the vessel as it settled onto the platform. A small crowd of court officials had gathered along the edges, not out of respect, but out of plain curiosity. Most of them had never seen a human up close. Ethan stepped off the ramp carrying one bag over his shoulder. He was not tall by human standards. He was not broad or physically impressive in any way the Xyrethan court would recognize as power. He had a calm face, brown eyes, short dark hair going slightly gray at the sides, and the kind of expression that gave away absolutely nothing. His clothes were plain formal wear, nothing decorated, nothing designed to draw the eye. He stepped onto the platform, looked around once at the guards and the watching officials and the wide pale sky above him, and then walked forward as if he had done this 100 times before. One of the junior court officials, a young Xyrethan named Drev, stepped forward to greet him. Drev spoke in the trade language of the coalition, speaking slowly the way most aliens did when they expected a human to struggle with communication. Ethan answered him in clean, unaccented Xyrethan, thanking Drev by name for meeting him and asking where he should put his bag. Drev blinked all 4 of his eyes at once. He had not expected that. Queen Savara met Ethan in the reception hall 30 minutes later. She stood at the far end of the long room with her advisors arranged behind her, wearing her formal crown and the deep black robes of the imperial house. She was tall, even by Xyrethan standards, with silver markings along her neck and jaw that spoke of her bloodline going back 14 generations. She had ruled the empire for 19 years and had not once been caught off guard by a foreign dignitary. She looked at Ethan Cole and felt nothing she could identify as concern. The ceremony was brief and without warmth. A coalition representative read the terms of the treaty aloud. Both parties signed the document. Savara pressed her imperial sigil into the seal. Ethan used a plain ink pen and signed his name in a clean, unhurried hand. The representative declared the alliance official. A few officials applauded. The rest simply watched and waited for it to be over. Savara spoke to Ethan directly for the first time as the room began to clear. She asked him, in Xyrethan, whether he understood what his role was here on Xyretha Prime. He said yes. She asked if he had brought any expectations with him. He said not particularly. She studied him for a moment the way she studied maps of contested territory, looking for anything worth noting, and then told him that a room had been prepared in the East Wing, that he was welcome to move freely through the public areas of the palace, and that he should not enter the council chambers without an invitation. He thanked her. She left. Her chief advisor, Corvesh, fell into step beside her as she moved down the main corridor. Corvesh had served the imperial court for 30 years and had strong opinions about most things. He told the queen quietly that the human appeared to be exactly what the initial reports had suggested, unremarkable, untitled, and of no political weight. He said it was probably intentional. Earth had sent this man because he would cause no problems and make no demands. Savara said she agreed and turned her mind to the rest of the day's schedule. Ethan, meanwhile, found his room in the East Wing, set his bag down beside the narrow bed, and spent the next 2 hours walking every corridor that was open to him. He moved without hurry. He did not take out a device or write anything down. He simply walked, paused in certain places, looked at certain doorways and junctions and guard rotations, and kept moving. A palace guard followed him at a respectful distance, as protocol required. The guard reported afterward that the human had done nothing unusual. By the 3rd day, Ethan knew the name of every guard assigned to the East and South Wings. He had also started greeting the kitchen staff by name when he passed through the lower corridors near the meal preparation rooms. This confused the kitchen staff considerably. No one of any standing in the palace had ever done that. Within a few days they were quietly setting aside a better portion of food for him at each meal, not because anyone told them to, but because it felt like the correct response. Savara heard this from Drev and said nothing about it. The court's opinion of Ethan did not shift. The general view was that he was polite, harmless, and essentially decorative. A few younger officials made quiet jokes about Earth sending a middle-aged man with a carry bag as their great gesture to the Empire. Corvesh did not put a stop to it. He found the jokes accurate enough. At the end of the first week, the Queen hosted a formal dinner for ambassadors from 3 neighboring systems. Ethan sat at the far end of the table, below the senior officials, beside a Zyrethan trade minister who spoke to him exactly once the entire evening. Ethan ate without complaint, listened to the conversations moving around him, and watched the room with an easiness that looked like boredom to everyone who glanced his way. Savara, from her seat at the head of the long table, looked at him once near the middle of the dinner. He was not looking at the food or at the officials near him. He was looking at the ambassador from the Dravery delegation, a wide, heavy-set creature with orange-tinted scales and small eyes that never quite settled on one place. Ethan's face had not changed. He still looked calm. But there was a quality to his attention, a stillness inside all the movement and noise of the dinner, that made Savara follow his gaze for a moment. She looked at the Dravery ambassador. She saw nothing she had not seen a dozen times before. She looked away. After the dinner ended and the guests moved to the outer halls, Ethan returned to his room in the east wing. He sat at the small desk near the window and wrote in a personal journal for a while. No one in the palace could have read it. It was written in a system that was not registered with the Coalition's language archives. When he finished, he closed the journal, rested his hands on the desk, and looked out at the dark sky above Zyretha Prime for a long time without moving. Out beyond the palace walls, the news channels across a dozen systems were still covering the marriage treaty with something between amusement and mild disbelief. Political commentators from several species agreed that it was an odd move for Earth, sending someone so thoroughly ordinary. A few analysts called it clever in a small way, a gesture that cost humanity nothing and offended no one. The Empire was not insulted because there was nothing to be insulted by. Ethan Cole was, by every available measure, exactly what he appeared to be. That was, of course, precisely the point. The second week at the Imperial Palace passed the way the first had, quietly and without incident. Ethan kept to the areas open to him, ate his meals without complaint, and continued learning the names of every person he came across, from senior officials to the workers who swept the lower corridors before sunrise. He asked questions when he had them, kept them short, and always listened to the full answer before speaking again. The palace staff had decided, without any official discussion, that he was fine. Not impressive, not important, but fine. The guards assigned to his wing stopped watching him quite as closely by the end of the week. There was simply nothing to watch. Corvesh continued to track Ethan from a distance, not because he believed the human posed any risk, but because it was his job to track everyone. His reports to the Queen remained brief. The human had attended a public council observation session and said nothing. The human had walked the Eastern Gardens for an hour in the early morning. The human had asked a senior archivist about the history of the Zyrethan trade routes, listened for 40 minutes, and thanked her before leaving. Savara read the reports and turned her attention elsewhere. What changed things, slightly, was the trade dispute. In the third week, a long-running disagreement between 2 Zyrethan provinces over shipping rights through a shared corridor reached the Imperial Council. It was not a new problem. It had been argued over for 6 years without resolution, and each session seemed to add new layers of complexity rather than solve the existing ones. The council met in the main chamber to hear updated proposals from both sides. Ethan had been granted permission to sit in the observation gallery above, as a formality, since observing open sessions was technically one of the rights extended to him under the treaty terms. He sat in the gallery above and said nothing for the first hour. At the end of the first hour, when both sides had made their cases and the council was no closer to a conclusion, Ethan leaned slightly forward in his chair. Drev was seated beside him, there to explain any proceedings Ethan might not understand. Ethan said nothing to Drev. He simply watched the floor below. Corvesh, who was running the session, asked both representatives if there were any final points before the council broke for deliberation. One of the province representatives, a broad Zyrethan named Sorvan, began to speak again. A quiet voice came from the observation gallery. It was barely loud enough to carry, but the hall had good acoustics, and Corvesh heard it. The voice said that both proposals were treating the corridor as a single resource, and that the real issue was the scheduling window during the cold transit months, not the ownership of the corridor itself. The voice said that if the window was divided into fixed blocks by season, both provinces could operate independently without ever crossing each other's shipments. The hall went still. Corvesh looked up at the gallery. Ethan was sitting back in his chair with his hands resting on the armrests, looking at nothing in particular. One of the council members asked, carefully, if the human in the gallery had just proposed a solution to a 6-year dispute in 30 seconds. Corvesh said he did not know yet, and called a short recess to review what had been said. It took the review committee 40 minutes to determine that the proposal was workable, had no obvious flaws, and would likely satisfy both provinces. Corvesh delivered this finding to the full council with the expression of a man who had bitten into something he had not expected. Savara heard about it before the session was formally closed. She said nothing and went about her afternoon. But she thought about it more than once over the following hours, in the spaces between other thoughts, the way you keep noticing a sound you cannot quite identify. That evening, she found herself walking past the east wing on her way to the upper observation deck. She had taken that route before, but not often. She saw light under Ethan's door and stopped. She was not sure why she stopped. She stood there for a moment, then knocked. He opened the door. He was not surprised to see her. He asked if she wanted to come in. She did not usually go to other people's rooms, but she stepped inside. The room was tidy. His bag was on a shelf, still mostly packed. There was a small arrangement of items on the desk, a journal, a cup, a flat device he used to read, but nothing personal displayed anywhere, no pictures or objects from home. Savara looked around the room and then looked at him. She asked him how he had known about the scheduling window issue in the corridor dispute. He told her that he had read through the public records of both provinces during his first week at the palace. The dispute had come up in the trade route archives, and the pattern in the shipping logs had pointed to the cold transit months as the actual pressure point. She asked why he had read through provincial shipping records during his first week. He said he read whatever was available. It kept his mind in order. She studied him for a moment, the way she had in the reception hall on the day he arrived. She still could not find anything that matched the kind of people she was used to dealing with. He was not angling for anything. He was not watching her face the way people did when they wanted something. He was just standing there, waiting for her to finish thinking. She asked him what else he had read. He told her. It took longer than she had expected. After that, she started stopping at his door in the evenings on a less accidental basis. They talked about the things he had read and what he thought about them, and she found that his observations were not the observations of someone performing intelligence to impress her. They were the observations of someone who found the information genuinely interesting. He asked her questions about the empire that no foreign dignitary had ever bothered to ask, not about military strength or trade routes or political alliances, but about how the provincial systems worked at the local level, what people in the outer systems complained about most, and why the archive records from one particular century were kept separately from the rest. She answered his questions. She was not sure why, at first. But the honest answer was that no one around her asked those kinds of questions, and it was a relief to think about them out loud. Corvesh noticed the evening visits within a week and added them to his reports without comment. He did not yet consider Ethan a threat. He considered him a curiosity, which was a slightly different thing and worth watching for different reasons. The court's jokes about the human had grown less frequent, though the overall opinion had not changed much. He was still harmless. He was still unimportant. The trade corridor solution had been quietly attributed to a council member who had raised a similar point in a session 3 years ago. No one corrected this. Ethan, if he noticed, did not say anything about it. He went on reading and walking the corridors and watching the rooms he was allowed into with the same steady attention. He had learned by now where most of the palace's structural weak points were, which corridors allowed for movement without being seen from the main guard posts, and which of the senior officials seated closest to the queen at formal dinners had a habit of looking toward the Dravery delegation more often than the conversation required. He had not yet said anything about that last part to anyone. He was still watching. There was more to understand before it would be useful to speak. The formal gathering was held in the Great Hall of the Imperial Palace on the 42nd day of Ethan's time on Zyretha Prime. It was a diplomatic evening, one of several the Empire hosted each year to maintain good relations with neighboring systems. 30 guests from 6 different species moved through the hall, accompanied by their staff and guards, all of them in formal dress and all of them speaking the careful, polished language of people who wanted something from each other but would not say so directly. Ethan stood near the far end of the hall with a drink he had not touched, watching the room. He had been watching the Dravery delegation for 12 days. The ambassador, a wide-framed creature named Greth, had attended 3 public events at the palace during that time. Each time, Greth's eyes moved in a way that was not consistent with casual social attention. They checked exits. They measured guard positions. They returned, more than once, to the Queen. Ethan had written 4 lines about this in his journal the previous evening. He had also changed where he stood at public events, placing himself at angles that gave him better lines of sight without appearing to do so. He had not told anyone. He did not yet have enough to say that would not sound like a foreigner making accusations against a legitimate diplomatic guest. The attack began at the midpoint of the evening. It came from 3 directions at once, which was well planned. The lights in the Great Hall dropped to near darkness as a jamming device cut the power to the lighting grid. There was a moment of silence in which no one understood what was happening, and then the sound of movement in the dark, fast, coordinated movement from figures who had been in the hall all evening, dressed as staff. The Queen's personal guard reacted immediately, but they had been built for visible threats in open space, and this was close quarters, interior darkness, and surprise. 2 guards went down in the first 10 seconds. 3 more were engaged and held in place by attackers who knew exactly how many guards there were and where they stood. Someone in the crowd screamed. The guests scattered. Corvesh was grabbed from behind near the center of the hall. A forearm pressed against his throat. He could not call out. He was pulled backward toward the eastern passage. Savara had moved instinctively toward the raised platform at the back of the hall when the lights dropped, the same way she always moved in uncertain situations, to high ground, with her back to a wall. She had 2 guards with her still, but she could see that the exits on the left and right were already blocked by figures in dark clothes moving through the low light with practiced efficiency. She reached for the short blade at her side. She was not without capability. But there were 6 visible figures closing the perimeter, and 2 of her own guard were already down, and the numbers were going the wrong way. Then Ethan was beside her. She had not seen him cross the hall. She had not heard him. He was simply there, on her left side, speaking in a low and completely steady voice. He said one thing, that she should stay behind him and not move toward either exit. Something in his voice made her stop reaching for her blade. He stepped forward. What happened next took less than 90 seconds from start to finish, though it did not feel that way to anyone watching. The 2 nearest attackers moved toward Ethan at the same time, the way trained individuals do when they are used to working as a pair. Ethan moved between them instead of away from them, which was not what they expected. The first went down before he completed his reach. The second was redirected into the wall with a controlled efficiency that looked almost slow until the result registered. The third attacker came from the right. Ethan had already moved right. The fourth came from behind. Ethan was no longer where behind had been. He did not use the Queen's blade. He did not use any weapon from the hall. He used his hands and his positioning and what appeared to be an absolute absence of panic. He worked through the room like someone who had mapped every part of it before the lights went out, because he had. He reached Corvesh in the eastern passage before the attacker holding him had moved 3 steps toward the exit. He freed the advisor with 2 precise movements and told him in Zyrethan to go to the wall and stay down. Corvesh, who had 30 years of court experience and had never in his life been told what to do by a foreign consort, went to the wall and stayed down. The last 2 attackers broke for the side exit. Ethan let them reach the door, where the palace guard from the outer corridor, who had responded to the power disruption, were waiting. The great hall went quiet. Ethan walked back to where Savara was standing. He was breathing harder than normal. There was a cut along the side of his left hand, shallow, from the second attacker's blade catching him at an angle he had not fully covered. He pressed his other hand over it without making anything of it. He asked the Queen if she was hurt. She told him she was not hurt. She was looking at him the way she had never looked at any person in 19 years of ruling an empire. She was looking at him as if she was seeing him for the first time, which was accurate, because she was. Around the hall, the remaining guests were still pressed against the walls. The palace guards who had come in from outside were securing the room. Someone had restored partial lighting. In the pale glow of the emergency panels, the faces of the court officials were visible, and every one of them was turned toward Ethan Cole. Corvesh stood near the eastern passage with his back straight and his formal robes torn at the collar. He looked at the human standing in the middle of the hall with the queen. He said nothing. He had nothing to say. His entire assessment of this man had just been wrong in every important way, and he was experienced enough to know exactly what that meant. Savara took a slow breath and looked at the cut on Ethan's hand. She told one of the nearby attendants to bring something to clean it. Then she looked back at Ethan. She said his name, just his name, nothing attached to it, and stopped. She had intended to say something. She could not find what it was. There was too much to ask and she did not know which question to start with. Ethan looked at her steadily and waited. He had been waiting a long time for this conversation. He was willing to wait a little longer. The truth did not come out all at once. It came out the way most important things do, in pieces, over several days, through people asking questions that finally got honest answers. The night of the attack, Savara sat across from Ethan in a private room off the main corridor with 2 guards outside the door and a medical attendant who had cleaned and sealed the cut on his hand. The queen had removed her formal crown and set it on the table, which she almost never did in the presence of anyone who was not her most trusted staff. She sat with her hands folded and looked at him and asked him, plainly, who he was. He told her. His full name was Ethan Cole, which she already knew. What she did not know was that the name attached to a classification within the Earth government that was not listed in any document the Galactic Coalition had access to. He told her about the program. He called it by its name, the Quiet Shield Initiative, and explained it the way someone explains something they have always known they would eventually have to explain, clearly, without rushing, and without looking away. The program had been built over 3 generations. It was not a military project. Earth had other programs for military purposes, and those were not what this was. Quiet Shield was built around a different question, which was, when the most important person in a room is in danger, who is the best possible person to be standing next to them? The answer required a specific kind of human. Not the largest or the most aggressive, but someone with a particular combination of traits, rapid pattern recognition, the ability to map physical environments quickly and hold them accurately, physical conditioning that went well beyond what the body could achieve through training alone, and an emotional regulation profile that did not break down under pressure. That last part was the hardest to achieve and the one that had taken the longest to develop. The biological enhancements were not dramatic in appearance. They did not make a person look different or move in a way that announced itself. They operated below the surface, faster neural processing, more efficient muscle response, a pain threshold that had been extended considerably, and a cardiovascular system that could sustain peak output longer than an unmodified human was capable of. None of it showed unless it was needed. Ethan was the 41st person trained under the program. He had been active for 11 years before this assignment. Savara asked why Earth had sent someone like this to her without telling her. He said the program only worked if the subject was not known to be what they were. A guardian who was publicly identified as a guardian was a different kind of target and a different kind of asset. The protection only functioned correctly when no one in the room was treating it as protection. She said that was a reasonable answer and also deeply unsettling. He said he understood that. She asked if she had been chosen specifically, or if this was a standard element of the treaty. He said both. The treaty had created the opportunity. Earth had then decided that the opportunity was worth taking seriously, and that Savara herself was someone whose survival was important enough to justify the assignment. She sat with that for a moment. The following morning, Corvesh was briefed. This went less smoothly than the conversation with the Queen, because Corvesh had 30 years of careful judgment behind him, and the revelation that his judgment had been completely wrong about someone for 42 days was not something he processed quietly. He sat through the briefing with his face arranged into an expression of controlled stillness and asked 3 very precise questions. When he got the answers, he sat quietly for a moment longer and then said that he needed to review everything he had filed in his reports about the human over the previous 6 weeks. No one told him that would change anything. He reviewed them anyway. The information reached the Galactic Coalition Council 2 days later, through channels that were unclear and would later be disputed. By the time it arrived, it had already been partially confirmed by Earth's diplomatic office, which released a statement acknowledging the existence of the Quiet Shield Initiative with a level of calm that suggested they had expected to make this statement eventually and had the words ready. The Council's reaction was not calm. Representatives from 6 species demanded an emergency session. The central question, raised loudly by the Carvan Federation's delegate, was how long humanity had been developing and deploying enhanced operatives in positions close to foreign heads of state without disclosure to the coalition. Earth's representatives answered the question directly. The program had been running for 31 years. There were currently 40 active operatives placed in various locations across the galaxy, each assigned to protect someone the Earth government had assessed as critical to galactic stability. The council chamber produced a noise that was not quite silence and not quite chaos. Several delegates spoke at the same time. Earth's lead representative, a composed woman named Carol Briggs, waited for the noise to settle. When it did, she said that none of the operatives had been placed as intelligence assets. None of them had been collecting information for Earth's use. They were there to keep specific individuals alive, and they had done so in 6 documented situations in the past 11 years, 5 of which had not been publicly attributed to human involvement. Someone asked who else was being protected. Briggs said that disclosing the locations of active operatives would defeat the purpose of the program, and that she would not be doing that. Another delegate asked what gave Earth the right to make unilateral decisions about who in the galaxy needed protecting. Briggs said that Earth had not asked for a right. Earth had looked at a galaxy full of critical figures who were poorly protected, made an assessment about what the consequences of losing any of them might be, and acted on it. She said humanity had not started this program because they were asked to. They had started it because they were good at it and because the stakes were high enough to justify the effort. The Dravri delegation had gone very still in their seats the moment the program was disclosed. They said nothing for the remainder of the session. When it ended, they filed out without speaking to anyone. 3 of their staff members were still in coalition custody from the night of the attack, and the connection between the Dravri syndicate and the assassination attempt was already being formally investigated. Across the galaxy's news channels, the story moved faster than anything in recent years. The framing shifted with each retelling, but the central image stayed the same: a human man, quietly dismissed, sitting at the far end of a dinner table and watching a room, protecting a queen who did not know she was being protected. The Zyrethan court did not know how to respond to this. The officials who had made jokes about Ethan in the early weeks said nothing publicly. Corvesh, when he was asked by a court correspondent for a comment, said only that the situation had been handled appropriately and that he had no further statement at this time. He then went back to his office and sat at his desk for a long time with nothing in front of him. He was thinking about the corridor dispute, and the evening walks, and the 42 days of reports he had written that had all said the same thing. He was thinking about how certain he had been. He was not used to being this wrong. He intended to spend some time figuring out how it had happened. 3 days after the news reached the Coalition Council, Savara called Ethan to her private meeting room in the upper part of the palace. It was a room she used when she wanted to speak without the usual audience of advisors and attendants. The windows looked out over the inner gardens, and in the morning light the silver markings on her jaw and neck were visible in a way they were not under the artificial lighting of the main halls. She told him to sit. He sat. She looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then she asked him the question she had been holding since the night of the attack, the one that was more important to her than any of the political questions being argued in the coalition chambers. She asked why he had not told her. He gave her the same answer he had given in the days before, that the program only worked in silence, that a known guardian was a compromised one, that the protection was real only when it was invisible. She listened to the full answer and then told him she had already understood that part. That was not what she was asking. She was asking why he specifically had not found a way, in 42 days of evening conversations in his room, to say something. He was quiet for a moment. Then he told her the truth, which was a simpler truth than the official one. He said that in his experience, people who were told they were being protected changed how they moved and how they made decisions. They started thinking about the protection instead of thinking about what they were doing. He had seen it happen to people who were strong and careful and smart, and it had made them worse, not better. He had not wanted that to happen to her. She said that was presumptuous of him. He said it probably was. She sat with that and looked out the window for a while. In the gardens below, 2 attendants were moving through the low green plants that grew along the stone paths. The morning was quiet and the sky above Zyretha Prime was the pale color it always was in the first hours of the day. She said, without looking at him, that she had made 17 formal decisions in the 42 days he had been at the palace. She asked if any of them would have been different if she had known what he was. He said he thought 4 of them might have been. He did not say which 4, but she could probably work it out. She looked at him then, and the expression on her face was not the controlled stillness she used in public. It was something older and more honest than that, the look of someone who had been carrying a great weight for a long time and had just become aware of it in a new way. She asked him if Earth did this, placed guardians without telling anyone, because they did not trust the people they were protecting to handle the information. He said it was not about trust. He said Earth had looked at the galaxy the way Earth always looked at difficult problems, which was to find the solution that actually worked rather than the solution that was easiest to explain, and the solution that actually worked happened to require silence. She thought about that for a long time. 2 days later, she called a full session of the Imperial Court. The hall was filled. Every senior official, every advisor, every representative of the provincial councils who was on Zyretha Prime had been asked to attend. Corvesh stood to her right in his usual place. Ethan stood further down, at the edge of the platform, in the same plain formal clothes he always wore. Savara spoke without notes. She described the events of the attack in plain language, without the formal framing she usually used for court addresses. She described what had happened in the Great Hall, and what had been disclosed in the days following. She was direct about the fact that the court, including its senior leadership, had assessed Ethan Cole as unimportant and had been comprehensively wrong. Then she said she was creating a new title within the Zyrethan imperial structure. The title was First Shield. It had never existed before. She explained what it meant, not a ceremonial role, not a political one, but a formal recognition of the function Ethan had performed. The First Shield stood at the center of the Empire's security structure, held the Queen's direct confidence, and answered to no other official in the court hierarchy. The title could not be given to someone who sought it. It could only be given by the monarch. She gave it to Ethan. The hall was very quiet. Corvesh, to his credit, was the first person to offer a formal acknowledgement of respect. It was a traditional Zyrethan gesture, the kind exchanged between equals of standing, and it was done correctly and without hesitation. It cost him something to do it, and everyone in the hall who knew Corvesh understood exactly how much. He did it anyway. Ethan accepted the gesture. He did not make a speech. He said 3 words in Zyrethan that translated roughly to an expression of gratitude that acknowledged the weight of what was being offered. Then he stepped back to his position at the edge of the platform. Across the galaxy, the news from the Imperial Court session spread through every major communication channel within hours. The story had already been moving fast since the disclosure at the Coalition Council, but this gave it a new shape. It was no longer just a story about a hidden program or a foiled attack. It was a story about a species that had spent 31 years quietly placing its most capable people in the most dangerous rooms in the galaxy, not for intelligence, not for political influence, but to keep people alive who needed to stay alive. Commentators from a dozen systems tried to find the right way to describe what humanity had done and mostly failed. The most honest response came from a political analyst on a mid-rim broadcast who said simply that Earth had identified a problem that everyone else had noticed and no one else had solved, and had solved it in the most human way possible, without announcing it, without asking for recognition, and without stopping. The Dravery Syndicate issued no statement. 3 of their officials remained in coalition custody. 2 members of the Zyrethan court who had been observed making contact with the Dravery delegation in the weeks before the attack were removed from their positions quietly and without public comment. Savara had made that decision herself. In the weeks that followed, Ethan continued to do most of what he had always done at the palace. He walked the corridors. He read through archives. He sat in on council sessions, no longer from the observation gallery but from a seat on the main floor. He still arrived at meetings without saying much, still listened more than he spoke, and still greeted every person he passed by name regardless of their rank. The court had stopped making jokes. Corvesh, for his part, began a practice of asking Ethan 1 question per day, a short, specific question about something Corvesh was working through in his own thinking. He framed it as making use of an available resource. In the evenings, when Savara passed by Ethan's door on her way to the upper deck, she now knocked without pretending she had ended up there by chance. The question that kept moving through the galaxy's political conversations in the months that followed was a new one. It was no longer about what humanity had to offer or whether this young and unproven species could be taken seriously at the larger table of galactic affairs. The question now was how many other quiet rooms had a human already standing in the corner, patient and still and watching, waiting for the moment when it mattered. Nobody had a confident answer. Earth, for its part, was not saying,